Pleasure to welcome you here tonight. Jermaine, thank you so much for joining us. I was looking, I have to admit, I just got a copy of your book and I've been going through it, and I really should have started with the first one as a product of the 60s. But it's a pleasure to welcome you here tonight to talk about post 9/11. And I think most people know you and professor at the New School. So welcome tonight. I just would like to start by mentioning 9/11. I think we all remember where we were on that day. And I was working at Bellevue Hospital in New York City when I heard about one plane imploding on the first tower. And then we actually had people at the hospital who saw the second plane imploding. My first thoughts were, my God, I know what's going to happen now. I know we're going to go back into another hot war. It's going to be used as an excuse. Um, we kind of emptied the hospital and prepared to take victims from the World Trade Center. There were very few who came to the hospital. I think, as everybody knows now, because there were not that many survivors. But it certainly started again, those hot wars, those years of what I knew was going to be anti-war peace movements. And so I leave it to you to take us forward from that day. And thank you again so much for joining us.
Okay, terrific. And then is it an option for me to share my screen? I believe it is.
Yes, you
And
can.
then, okay, terrific. I'm going to go ahead and do that. And I need to find the PowerPoint. Okay. Um, okay, so can everybody both see that and see me? Yes, it seems so. Okay. I mean, so first let me say, like, it's such a pleasure to be invited by you all. This book was a labor of immense work and love, and the greatest satisfaction is that it offered me the opportunity to pay appropriate honor to the sacrifice and courage of countless anti-war activists, including members for Veterans for Peace. Indeed, Veterans for Peace has a robust place in the book. I knew a bunch of Veterans for Peace members before I started my research and had deep admiration for the group. And then my admiration for the group soared as I learned about its many activities following 9/11. And then I should also say that the research allowed me to meet new people and make new friends. And then one of them pictured here is Ward Riley, and I'm dedicating tonight's talk in, his loving memory. I should say, as I was wrapping up the book, the press said, "Oh, you need photographs." So I wrote Veterans for Peace folks very innocently and said, "Might you have any photographs?" And they said, "You should really talk to Ward." And as many of you know, he was a compulsive, inveterate photographer who had probably thousands of pictures of hundreds of meetings and actions. And then we became close discussing his photographs, emailed in odd hours of the night. Anytime I mentioned a person or an event, he would send me 6 pictures of it. Several of his photographs are used in the book. He was very proud of that. I'm very proud of that as well. And then more than anything else, he sort of mentored me in how to think as a civilian about military resistance to war, stressing that as a civilian, I would never really understand the perspective or at the very least the experience of anti-war veterans. And that was a very important message. He took great interest in the book, is the only person aside my wife to have read a draft. He was so proud of his contribution to it, so proud of Veterans for Peace, so proud that his photographs were there, and so proud of his work, in the movement. And, it's so sad that he died, but fortunately, he's immortalized, in a new way. And I can't think of the book without, thinking of my memories of this man who I quickly befriended, but never actually had a chance to meet. And that's something we had planned, but alas. So in my time tonight, and I don't want to talk at you for too long, I want to keep this to maybe 20, 25 minutes and have time for discussion. I want to say a bit about myself, why I wrote the book, indicate some of its main points, and then indicate how I place Veterans for Peace in the narrative. And I discuss many groups. Voices for Creative Nonviolence, Code Pink, September 11th Families, etc. This will be a VFP heavy presentation for obvious reasons. In ways, the origins of this book is the story of my life. I was born in 1967, came of age in the wake of the Vietnam War, and my early sense of my politics and morality was really forged through consideration of the war. I became obsessed with draft resistance, saw immense courage of young men and women refusing induction into an immoral war. As I learned more, I saw even greater courage in the men and women in the military, whether in bases in America or Europe or deployed to Vietnam, who rejected a war that they were fighting or were perhaps going to be sent to fight. Growing up, I read avidly about anti-war protest. I teach about the Vietnam War, stressing GI resistance, Dewey Cannon, Terry's remarkable testimony, the original Winter Soldier hearing, etc. And as was indicated by Susan, again, post 9/11, America was back in the business of hot wars. There was indeed a vast, dynamic, diverse, and I would argue consequential anti-war movement of which I was a part, chiefly through Witness Against Torture, but in other capacities as well. And yet, there is today almost no trace of the movement in public memory. No big book about it until now, no movie celebrating it, no imagery like draft card burning or enduring protest songs from the movement. It feels almost like there's a conspiracy of silence about a movement that it's in its own day, as you know, often felt hidden in plain sight, struggled against a functional media blockade to sort of emerge and help shape public consciousness. And in the absence of this kind of reflection, a lot of anti-war activists, like the people on this call, don't quite know how to feel about those years of their lives. And I discovered most activists feel some measure of pride and anger and sorrow and shame that we weren't able to, accomplish more. For that matter, there's little sustained public conversation about any aspect of the war on terror, as if it's a history too painful in its origins, 9/11, uncertain in its outcomes, filled with fear and fury, deceit and death to quite know what to do with. So rather than reckoning with this terrible and traumatic history, the country kind of, sets it aside. The war on terror has left a mostly unexamined and I think dangerous legacy, a vague sense that stupid wars should be avoided, enhanced executive powers used in a new spree of cruelty and killing now aimed at immigrants and alleged narco traffickers, and the same fear-driven demonization of a racialized enemy other that got the United States into so much trouble years ago. So with this book about a protest movement, I seek to incite a broader reckoning with the past in hopes that reason and caution and diplomacy and compassion may in the future prevail. That's at least, the animating hope that this stirs some honest reflection about what America went through and what America did to the world and what responsibilities we have to the future. I wrote it with two more specific purposes in mind. I believe that anytime a grave injustice exists, it's important for the moral and historical record to know who spoke up and why, what they did, and what difference they made. I regard the war on terror in its totality as a grave injustice. The statistics are frightening. 1 million dead as a direct consequence of U.S. intervention, 4 million indirect deaths, 38 million people displaced, 7,500 or so U.S. military dead, an equal number of contractors working with allies killed, and many, many times more that wounded, some traumatic brain injuries, missing limbs, et cetera, et cetera. And then people stood up to try to stop and then limit the insanity and limit the death and destruction. And I want to give them their due and then write this movement into the great annals of American descent and have the movement sit proudly alongside abolition, the suffrage movement, the civil rights movement, the Black Power movement, the anti-Vietnam War movement, occupying its sort of rightful place as a movement to honor and study and learn from in both its successes and its failures. Second, I wish to forever annihilate justifications for the Iraq War that one still hears, that our leaders acted in good faith to protect the country and were the victims of consequences both unforeseeable and unforeseen. And this applies to Afghanistan as well. Yet, with chilling precision, anti war voices predicted exactly the disaster that would follow an unhinged military response to 9/11. And then Susan sort of indicated that by saying that on day one, you knew that the American response was going to be in a grave overreaction and basically instigate a new open ended era of war making. Which brings me perhaps to the central point of the book. That the great strength of the movement at some level was being right, indeed profoundly right about most everything, especially the disaster that would follow from an invasion of Iraq. The Iraq War, I argue, is the greatest case of I told you so in American political history, where people said this, and this would happen. All of that came, to pass. The triumph of the movement, if we can speak in those terms, was being vindicated by the multiple disasters that unfolded, and more positively, the eventual turning of a critical mass of American hearts and minds against the war in Iraq and then eventually even the war in Afghanistan. That vindication, however, does not quite feel like victory because there simply was too much death and destruction before the wars came to an end to the extent that they, even did. So for me, the war on terror is an ultimately dispiriting message, despite the heroism of the resistance, of the terrible price that's paid when informed and conscientious voices of dissent are ignored, dismissed, and belittled in a breakdown of deliberative processes that define a healthy democracy, right? So the war on terror was sort of a symptom of a breakdown of democracy at home. It's broken down even further. And thoughtful, conscientious people who knew the region, who knew history, who knew Iraq, etc., were sort of blithely ignored by people hell-bent on invasion and conquest. So what do I mean that the movement was right in greater detail? From the start, literally from 9/11, people expressed profound concerns. And then I'll highlight three, some of which should be familiar to you. Right after 9/11, Phyllis and Orlando Rodriguez, who lost their son in the Twin Towers, said in an open letter, our government is going down the path of violent revenge that will make civilian victims half a world away. Let us not add to the inhumanity of our time. Well, the US added to that inhumanity, killing vastly more civilians in multiple theaters than died on 9/11. In this violence, the United States repeated rather than avenging the crime of 9/11 and really defeated the whole stated moral purpose of the war on terror, which was the preservation of the sanctity of life and civilian life in particular. Barbara Lee, when opposing the AUMF, said, quote, let us not become the evil we deplore. Embracing the dark side, the United States became that evil through torture, other detainee abuse, and civilian massacres, Haditha, other places. Last, Rita Lazar, another 9/11 parent who lost a child, pleaded not long after 9/11 that we, quote, not unleash forces we will not have the power to pull back. Indeed, the 9/11 was used as a pretext for a crazed imperial gambit producing endless wars in multiple theaters, some of which are still to some extent active. So you have a concern with civilian casualties, with war crimes and endless war, all before the first missile was even launched at Afghanistan. And I know that Kathy Kelly had a similar reaction just after 9/11, in fact, wept telling herself, oh my God, this isn't going to end. And then for, 2 decades, it didn't end. So those are three individual voices. Now thinking a bit more systematically, who spoke out first? And then I often joke that it was the pacifists and the communists, right? Like waging nonviolence, some, Quaker groups, and then folks like the International Action Center who form Answer. And then the pacifists kind of lead with a moral critique of war, aware that historically it's so often driven by economic interest. This was a big lesson from the solidarity work in Latin America. And the communists tend to have a geopolitical critique of imperialism while aware of the human cost of war. And then, interestingly, the two main groups that did sanction busting work in the 1990s were either pacifists like Waging Nonviolence or folks like the International Action Center. And it wasn't quite an alliance, but it is interesting how those two groups from different perspectives were involved in some of the same work. Now, the third group I would add, and this kind of occurred to me just today, is the anti-war veterans like yourselves. And as you may or may not know, a VFP member, Greg Neese, took out a full-page letter that he drafted just after 9/11 in the New York Times and LA Times. It was published in October 2001. The letter asked, what right do we have to take more innocent lives? Isn't that also not a form of terrorism? And then interestingly, money for the ad was raised by peace groups in Japan who knew, the legacy of Hiroshima, etc. More dramatically, perhaps, this is one of Ward's pictures. He was in a hotel on September 11th and wrote that night on hotel stationery. Today, both World Trade Centers in New York were destroyed. An act of war that will now give the military establishment a green light to go crazy. And as a historian, you do cartwheels over a document like this, penned literally on 9/11. Its message obviously is grave. So why were veterans, such powerful heralds to warn of the danger and messengers for peace? And here I'm telling you stuff familiar to you all, but I had to put it together in my own mind. There's a bunch of reasons. I mean, first, from experience the pattern and practice of U.S. war making. So often, as you well know, the aim is to subjugate, not liberate foreign peoples through false appeals to American values like freedom and democracy or exaggerated claims about threats to national security. Wars are started and run by civilian politicians driven by arrogance, pride, vanity, self-interest, with no conception of what they're putting American soldiers through, and certainly no conception of the harm they're doing to foreign peoples. Further, wars are most often mismanaged, subject to corruption, profiteering, and deceit. This was true in Vietnam. It was true in, Iraq as well. In addition, you all know as veterans that no matter how noble the mission, U.S. soldiers will almost invariably be perceived and attacked as invaders, even in countries they're trying to help. And last, veterans know that they have a special responsibility to limit the harm faced by new generations of soldiers and a special credibility in the culture where people can't contest so easily their patriotism. And simply put, people will listen to an anti-war veteran in a way they might not listen to some random anti-war activist who doesn't, in their mind, sort of have the credential to criticize, America. And then VFP, to its credit, takes that responsibility incredibly seriously. With this basic notion, not one more soldier should die in some, misbegotten war. And that was what motivated Cindy Sheehan, not one more mother's child, or motivated the Peaceful Tomorrows folks, not one more parents, child, uncle, brother, etc. So there's, a nobility in that sense of mission. So what did Veterans for Peace do? And then, you all did this. I don't need to sort of tell you your own history, but the way I contextualize it might be somewhat interesting. I mean, four main things: tried to warn the world of the disaster of war, tried to prevent and then end wars once they started, tried to use creative ways to dramatize the costs of war, and then help catalyze and grow a larger military peace movement, a term coined by the scholar Lisa Leitz that includes veterans of old wars, veterans of new wars like IVAW, military parents, and family members, and then dissident members of the military establishment itself. So VFP, I would argue, played a catalytic role in helping to give focus and agency to this much larger community of people in the military community broadly to assert their voice. I'm going to share with you a sort of very partial list of what I think are significant actions and contributions of VFW beyond participation in conventional protest and vigils that, many of you did for many, many years. So one is this thing called a statement of conscience that was drafted by some VFP folk in the run-up to the Iraq War. And then it was addressed to active duty service folks in any branch of the military, making three main points: that Americans deployed overseas will indeed be hated as invaders. Second, that if you kill civilians, no matter the context, you will be a murderer and have to live with those consequences. And third, that soldiers have a duty to the Constitution and the genuine preservation of American safety, not to the president, leading them into misbegotten wars. Secondly, Veterans for Peace members were involved in the Iraq peace team delegations organized by voices in the wilderness that were present in Iraq before and during the U.S. invasion. And then some VFP folk are here. Kathy Kelly is there, Mike Ferner, I believe. And then this is a vigil at the Iraq-Kuwaiti border in February, where they're trying to sort of stand in the way between two hostile and opposing forces. And apparently one veteran, George Leideke, I believe is his name, sort of bellowed across the border this sort of anti-war statement. And then he's sort of a decorated war hero. So the sense of, screaming from the rooftops or the desert's flat doesn't get any more, vivid than this. This is another photograph of the same vigil that, some of you will remember. And then this is a remarkable picture of the Iraq peace team in the Al Fanar Hotel when the U.S. invading soldiers make it to Baghdad. And then these Marines are wondering, A, what the hell am I doing here? And B, who the hell are these peacenik Americans with, signs of peace on this, hotel facade? And it was clearly a very, very powerful encounter. In addition, VFP members were part of a very important delegation that went to Iraq in December 2003, organized by Global Exchange, that brought parents of soldiers, including active VFP members, to Iraq. And then out of that trip was launched the Bring Them Home Now campaign, run by military, the MS, Military Families for Peace. What's their name again? I'm forgetting. I'm forgetting the name, but yeah, coordinated by sort of military families. And this was the first major anti-war grouping to call for the immediate role of U.S. soldiers. And then in Iraq, they saw how disastrous the occupation was, understood that if the occupation continued to be so dysfunctional, their children would increasingly be the targets of Iraqis' anger. And then one member visited his son on a base who said, "Dad, these folks hate us. They don't want us here." And that's exactly the reception that statement of conscience had, predicted. And then VFP was an important partner in this evolving campaign. In the 2004 election, VFP played a leading role in confronting Kerry, calling him back to his anti-war past. You all printed a big banner with a version of his famous line, "How do you ask a soldier to be the last person to die for a mistake?" It was changed to "lie." And then that image and messaging kind of haunted the campaign. And then, of course, the 2004 annual convention of VFP was held in Boston, and that was the occasion and the place for the birth of IVAW, that announced publicly its existence on the last day of that convention. And then I would like to think that the VFP was almost like the doula, sort of giving birth to this new generation of anti-war veterans. And in the early days, very much functioned as its patron, lending staff, lending money, lending sort of technical know-how, and perhaps most importantly, helping these young soldiers, many of them still with the trauma of combat, emotionally navigate taking a public and to many Americans very unpopular, stand about a raging war that the president says is vital to American, security. And I think one of the, most tender and important functions was this meeting of the hearts and minds among different generations of veterans and work to empower the IVA folk to themselves be powerful. In addition, Veterans for Peace encourage IVAW to have a major showing at a demonstration in Fayetteville, North Carolina, on the second anniversary of the Iraq War, not in Washington or New York City, but focused on the military community, trying to go public with the fact that there were dissenters in the military, including active duty, including recent veterans, including sort of older veterans, and then trying to sort of amplify the voice of the military community as part of a larger tableau of anti-war resistance. Then, yeah, and here's other pictures of IVAW. I'm sure you recognize a lot of these folks as friends and comrades. And these are all Ward's photos, I should say. And I have many, many, many on my hard drive. This one is, I think, especially powerful. Next, I'll say that VFP contributed mightily to what I call the politics of truth that drove the movement, right? And then the politics of truth traffics in this sort of basic stubborn civic faith that if only enough people knew and could feel the reality, the deceitful origins of the war, the disastrous course of the war on Iraq, the intolerable human cost, they would, in some meaningful sense, turn against it. And if you could win Americans' hearts and minds, that grievance would trickle up into the political establishment and you would have some shot at ending the war. So then the challenge was like how to make truth speak against the propaganda of the Bush administration, against a biased and jingoistic media, against a racism that says who really cares about the suffering of these, brown-skinned Muslims, half a world away, and against the kind of post-truth politics already present under Bush, in which no damning revelation seemed to change enough people's minds. The fact that there was no WMD, Abu Ghraib, what the 9/11 Commission found out, all of this was known, and yet he was reelected in 2004, unbelievably, by a larger majority than, well, he didn't even win, this time winning the popular vote, had actually sort of gained votes. But people tried mightily to sort of communicate the truth in compelling ways. And then one of them was Arlington West, where in November 2003, Veterans for Peace members started to put crosses on a beautiful beach in Santa Barbara. I lived in Santa Barbara for a year. It's this majestic beach for every dead US soldier. And then every Sunday for years continued doing this. And they would wake up, at 5 in the morning and move all the crosses and, repair broken crosses. It was a ritual approached with a near religious, sense of devotion. And then the crosses expanded and they would include Stars of David and, crescents to include other faiths. And then this was, a very powerful monument to the dead and at least implicit anti-war statement. And it became a kind of pilgrimage site for parents of dead soldiers, especially living on the West Coast who couldn't so easily, get to Washington to visit and think about what their son or daughter died for. And Cindy Sheehan actually visited this a year before she established, Camp Casey. And then Arlington West gave rise to the Eyes Wide Open display of the American Friends Service Committee. And then eventually Code Pink had something called Walk in Their Shoes. And that was exclusively civilian footwear meant to dramatize all the civilians killed in Iraq. And I should say that the Santa Barbara exhibit eventually included an indication of how many miles of beach would be required to have monuments to all of the dead in Iraq. So there was some consciousness of, other folks as well. And then, of course, Veterans for Peace had a major role in the establishment and maintenance and power of Camp Casey. And then, you all are like doubtless familiar with it. I'll give you, the most compressed version, but more importantly, indicate why I think it was so significant. So Cindy Sheehan is the mother of a soldier. She's against the Iraq War. He dies early in the war. She's horrified and feels guilty and blames herself because she never spoke out against the war. She comes out of her stupor when her daughter says, "Look, Mom, get it together. You just can't wallow in sort of self-pity and suicidal despair. And then she's kind of reborn with this sense of mission to prevent any more deaths. And then she's in California and hears Bush saying, 14 Marines died today, but they died for a noble cause. And she just goes berserk and then says, "For what noble cause did my son die? I'm going to come to Crawford, Texas, and ask that question to Bush." And then she says that she found her hands typing those words before she could even rationally think about the practicability of this plan. As it turns out, the VFP convention was in Dallas, not too far from Crawford. She went there, assembled a team of VFP folks who broke from the convention on the last day to set up, Camp Casey. This was its leading banner. And then these are some photos of Camp Casey. So many of these, I believe all of these taken by, Ward Riley, among other things. There was an Arlington West style, field set up, a nightly vigil. This is a professional photograph, and then there's a U.S. Marine Corps veteran, a gay man who was like literally outed on CNN, a accomplished trumpet player who would play taps at sundown. You see also Joan Baez. Apparently, they became good friends and are sort of friends to this day. And then, by all accounts, it was an incredibly powerful community of military parents, IVAW members, folks like Code Pink, Veterans for Peace folks, and it became a magnet for anti-war people all over the country, and politicians and celebrities visited. And then for the first time since the war started, on a sustained day-to-day basis, there were major stories in the media about this encampment. And then part of what made it so powerful is that a single mother asking this idiot president, "Why did my son die?" is to really ask on behalf of all mothers and fathers in the whole world, why is anyone dying, in this war? And then clearly it captured people's imagination. There were some problems around the celebrity status that Cindy Sheehan got, and some infighting and some resentments here and there. But without anyone quite designing it, it ended up being this brilliant and protracted and powerful and relatable story that helped the country in a much more intense way question the war. And then Camp Casey breaks up as Katrina hits. And this is significant because Bush horribly mismanages Katrina, tells the head of FEMA, "You're doing a heck of a job," when anyone can see the US government isn't doing a heck of a job. There's the famous photo of him on Air Force One flying over the Gulf, detached from this disaster under his watch. And then people started to doubt his competence in a new way and say, if he's delusional about Camp Casey, delusional about Hurricane Katrina, maybe he's delusional about Iraq as well. Do the people in charge really know what they're doing, and can we trust anything that they say? And then this is coincidentally the time at which a very solid majority of Americans, per polling, said we're against the war in Iraq and we want a U.S. withdrawal, even if it means the defeat of America's military objectives. And then the war never survives those numbers. They never reverse. And then I would argue that the fall of 2005 really is the beginning of the end of the war in Iraq, which doesn't end until 2011 when Obama pulls out the last troops. Some troops go back in to fight ISIS. There's, much more death and destruction thereafter. Haditha happens thereafter. Some of the worst violence, happens thereafter. But in some sense, an irreversible process was put into motion. The Democrats sweep the midterms in 2006, running on an anti-war platform. Murtha breaks with the war and says the American people are way ahead of Congress on this. The Iraq Study Group basically tells Bush, you have to get out now, and here's how. There's the surge, but all it does is buy America, some time. So to the extent that there was something like a turning, a phrase, from the, VVAW, and Kerry's famous speech, this was kind of, the moment of turning. And then Camp Casey was followed by a very important demonstration pictured here, walking to New Orleans Veterans and Survivors March for Peace and Justice. So IVAW folks, VFP folks had a sort of 200-mile march from Alabama to, New Orleans, and then talked to communities along the way, Katrina survivors, veterans of the war, dispossessed poor people who saw a consistent pattern of government malice and government neglect. And then saw in America conditions similar to what they saw in Iraq. And this is Brett Reppenhagen. And another guy said, it's the same fucking shit I see in Iraq, right? Just piles of rubble and mismanagement and collapsed infrastructure, and so forth. And then, of course, the VFP was there to, the bitter end. You see pictured the Iraqi journalist throwing his shoe at Bush, saying that this is for the orphan children of Iraq, you dog. On Bush's last day in office, there was a protest called the End of an Era, where Americans repeating that gesture threw shoes at the White House. Shoes was a big symbol in all of this. And then this is the pair of Ward Riley's boots that he threw at the White House. And then it's a very rich image where you have the voided Constitution, anger at Bush, an IVAW sticker, and then the sort of personalization of the sense of grievance at these sort of two horrible men on top of a horrible military establishment who, sacrificed the lives of young, women and men and many, many, many more people around the world. So that sort of concludes my presentation. And then the big question of what did or didn't we accomplish, it has no easy answers. I mean, I have my own sense, but some people like Ann Wright, I interviewed her and she said, I don't think we made a damn bit of difference. They were hell-bent to leather to fight their war and they didn't give an F what the anti-war movement thought. Other people like David Courtwright, the head of Win Against War, says, no, the movement moved from the streets to the campaign trail to the ballot box in the White House, and Obama ended it. The system worked. And then there's all kinds of thoughts and perspectives in between. So I kept to my allotted time. I'm so happy. This had a certain energy, I think, even through Zoom. And then now I'd be delighted, to engage in conversation. And then clearly the book has much, much more than I could speak to now. And there's many other groups who played very, significant roles. And then if like I misrepresented factually anything about VFP history, my apologies in advance. I was dealing with thousands of facts and thousands of documents and tried to get things as right as I could. So thank you. And
Thank
I'll,
you
I'll
very
undo
much.
screen share. Okay, great.
Oh, it's good to see those boots there.
Yeah.
Would you all raise your hand if you want to speak? And thank you. That was a lot to present in just a few minutes.
I tried, and thanks for the floating collapse, Kathy. It means a lot. Kathy also has a very central role in this book, and in fact, the literal last words in the book is a quote from her that's so stunningly beautiful. I literally cry every time I read it. But yeah, questions, comments?
I think you've left everybody speechless. Questions for
Susan's really breaking up. I don't know if anything can be done about that.
I didn't go ahead.
Yeah, I was wondering if that was just me or her. So,
No, it's
Susan,
me.
your internet is.
Yes, I know.
And then feel free
Thank
to
you.
drop a question or comment in the chat that I can respond to if you're bashful about speaking. Go for it,
Anthony
Anthony.
has a hand up.
Yeah.
Anthony's
Great.
not
There you
bashful.
go. Well, he mentioned the word bashful. Got to me. No, Jeremy, first of all, thank you so much. Thank you for the years of the work that you've done with Guantanamo. Very inspiring for me going down there. It's just wonderful to have your leadership down there for that very important thing. It was very fed my soul that someone was standing up so beautifully for that outrage. But I also want to really thank you for thanking the Veterans for Peace. I'm an associate member, and I just feel the same way you do. My so much honor goes out to the vets that have taken so much crap. So that's really it. No, thank you very much is really all I want to say. I, unlike everyone else on this call, it seems, did not know on the first day of the towers being hit that we were going into war. because I was involved with the rescue effort all that day and night. I was just focusing on that and didn't even think about this stuff. And it didn't occur to me at all until Bush came to the pile, which I think was 2 or 3 days later. And that's when it hit me, when I heard him get up on that pile and call for vengeance. I remember this shudder going down my spine, like, oh no, oh no, oh no. Because there was so much goodwill that night and that next day. There was so much around the world. Iran called right away, offering help. So you know all this stuff. But anyway, so I was a couple of days delayed before I figured out that we're going to war again. Uh, yeah, but thank you for thanking the vets. Right on.
Sure. I mean, and let me say, like, I was in New York, living in Jersey City. You could like see the Twin Towers if you leaned your head out my window. And then
Yeah.
I was sort of too traumatized to think about the geopolitical implications. I mean, it hit me a little bit later than some. And then, like, I'm, very gratified that you're thanking me. I should say that, my work in the anti-war movement, I never thought I would write a book one day. I wasn't approaching my participation as an ethnographer, but at some point it dawned on me that I have perhaps a responsibility here. I have a professional skill set as a historian. I know a lot of the principles. I have that sense of the post-Vietnam climate. And, this was just like not another work of scholarship, but something, deeply meaningful that I knew would be meaningful to, other people. So either Alice or Tarak.
I got Alice up. She was first.
Okay, great.
Alice is on screen. Go ahead, Alice.
First of all,
Yes.
thank you so much for bringing us back to that. And also for reminding us that we're still there. I mean, this is like, it's so unbelievable. And it had nothing to do with terrorists. It had to do with what Ray McGovern calls the Mickey Mat, the military, industrial, congressional, intelligence, media, academic thing. They're crafting this message for us. They wanted the war. We don't even know what really happened with the World Trade Center. It's the last chapter of the 911 report is still classified. And so is the Kennedy assassination. I mean, there's so much that we don't know about that we still have to know about. I know the veterans are out front, and I was particularly thrilled with Code Pink because they invented themselves because of 911, because Bush was saying code red for danger, code yellow for warning, code orange alert. And they said, we're code pink for peace. I mean, what kind of response was that to go bomb Afghanistan? It never made sense. It never added up. But anyway, thank you for the book, and I hope it helps us to move forward somehow.
Very good. I mean, that's the hope. Terrific. Tarak, go for it.
Okay. So thank you, Alice. Alice said something that's important, I think. When you think about what did the movement do, which you brought up in your talk, Jeremy. By the way, thank you very much. It's an excellent talk. Which you brought, well, Anne Wright says we didn't do a fucking thing, you know? And somebody, Cartwright said, no, 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 we did this, we did that. There was something left out, and I want to see what you think about it. And
Please.
that something left out was the fact that there was a community that came together, that through all of this became stronger, became more connected, was active, was not silent. And that is important. That is something that is very important, that this community of resistance throughout all of this does not go away, does not disappear, does not become silent, but it still is here and it still is thriving as much as possible. We're still doing it. And I want to see it if you think that. I mean, that's what you wrote the whole book about.
Right. No, no. And then it's a beautiful point. And then like I'm happy to say that I very explicitly echo the point that you say. Like there's a part where I say, I sort of speculate, how do you measure the effect of all of this? As it's simply influence of policy? Or, can you succeed sort of in other capacities? And then affection and compassion and bonding and friendship and shared sacrifice and the genuine creation of durable, enduring community. All of this matters. And that this is something that Dave Potorti, one of the 9/11 family members, wrote about very eloquently. Like, does a gesture of kindness towards an Afghan child from a Westerner, matter? And then from a policy standpoint, maybe not, but at a human level and at a cosmic level, maybe it does. And then in Witness Against Torture, which, as you know, was very powerful community, with this sort of Christian sense of belovedness, we thought that the work we were doing sort of with each other and in compassionate solidarity with people very much unlike ourselves was itself a form of fighting terrorism. Because if terrorism is about fear, suspicion, and division, the antidote is connection, listening, and compassion across the boundaries of religion, the boundaries of race, the boundaries of nation. Kathy Kelly did incredible work in that register of connection. And I'm so glad you brought this up, because it's something that hit me in a very profound way, and you put it into your own beautiful language. And then here we are, fighting in cases like the same people and a different version of the same evil. And like, sadly, that's our fate now, but one can always hope for better times. I think George had a hand up, and maybe we can take this as a last question. We seem to be sort of losing folks off the Zoom, but go for it.
George.
On mute. Sorry.
You're muted now.
We can't hear you, George. Still can't hear you.
Here I am.
Yeah, there you are.
Now we can.
The pictures that you showed and the activities bring back a flood of memories. And the March Along the Gulf, got to really know a lot of the Iraq vets. And one thing I remember, we were marching from Mobile to, I guess, going towards Mississippi, first or second town. Might have been Bayou Battery on the border there. Anyway, when we marched, many times I've been leading cadence chants, and I got two different responses from the Iraq vets. One guy come up to me and says, "We're too raw. This is not something that's helpful for us." And then as soon as I stopped the chants, another Iraq vet come up to me and said, "Why did you stop?" So there was a lot of interesting turmoil going on within these people. And by the time we got to New Orleans, every night just about, there was music. Yeah, the Vietnam vets would play guitar and sing songs, and the Iraq vets would do. And then the different groups would sort of intermingle, but a lot of times would split up. And they would share stories of healing each other and understanding the other person's trauma and trying to tell them if they had similar or different ideas about how to deal with that trauma. It was really a beautiful thing to watch.
I imagine it was. And then I wish I had been on that march. I wasn't. And then, scenes of compassion and healing and reciprocal kindness like took place in so many, contexts. And then, I remember Lisa Lights describing to me these sort of testimonials veterans would give at Camp Casey. And she described them as pylons of love, where you had these warriors holding hands, crying in each other's arms, and then images of tenderness and vulnerability that are so different from, the sort of macho persona that people are supposed to have.
I did a week down at Camp Casey.
Oh, great.
Dave Klein called me at home and said, "Our VFP group is looking a little raggedy down there. Could you go down there and cut the reins and try to make people work together?"
Yeah.
And it was a very interesting experience. Jeff, the bugler, great guy.
Right.
Cindy had gone home. We had to pick her up at Waco Airport. Her mom had a heart attack or something in California. Anyway, we did like a military operation. We rolled into the terminal. I told the security guards at Waco Airport that Jeff is her lead security man, and he's going to escort her out into our waiting van that we had. And everything went fine. But the cohesiveness of people who had never worked together really shocked me. You know, it was no people trying to self-glorify themselves. Everybody just put their nose to the grindstone and got the job done. And it worked in the end.
Right. No, great. Thank you so much. And then beautiful comments from Anthony in the chat. Does anyone have an additional question? If not, I'll say one or two things to sign off.
Just quickly, Jeremy, what I'd like to mention, since I was in a major public hospital at that time,
Right.
and what was extraordinary was people really worked together. For the first time, there were about 3,500 people who worked at Bellevue, and it was an extraordinary experience to see people working together without arguing, without any strife between the healthcare professionals. And also New York City. I don't know how many folks who are on the call were in New York at that time. It was as though people were driven together to care about each other. And it led me to think, what is it that gets people to work together? As Tarek said, we're in this world together right now. And so we bond and we work together to try to accomplish peace again. But what else besides having that outside threat? And just quickly mention that we knew then about Giuliani. It didn't have to go on for years, that he was a monster and he was incapable of planning. And we saw Bush on that pile and took the bodies that came from it and knew that neither men cared. They only cared about themselves and their own political future. And I'll just say the last thing is it just hit me as somebody who had been so active during Vietnam that this gives us these men in power, the opportunity to go for another war. No matter how wonderful it was that people came together, you could kind of see that force going on. So I'll stop
Yeah,
there.
no, absolutely. I mean, beautifully said. And then, as somebody alluded to earlier, there was so much goodwill towards America that was almost immediately squandered, from Nelson Mandela to the Dalai Lama to whomever. Some of them issued warnings about the perils of overreaction, but the United States, sort of pissed it all away. And it could have been a new dawn. There was a sense of how you could respond in a legalistic and non-military fashion and try folks a la Nuremberg and show America's dedication to due process and the rule of law. And they threw all of that out. So, I mean, thank you so much. You've been like wonderful conversation partners. Becky is gone, but she was instrumental in making this event happen. I will say that, the book has much more than I could talk about. And then I would love it if people would like actually read the book. And then you all, like me, are older folks who still read books and know what they are. So I'm passionate about, this history. There's lots of stuff that will be familiar to you, a lot of stuff you don't know about. And then let me just say that I'd be delighted to do similar events with any other VFP chapter, state, regional, whatever, that might be interested. And if Becky's back. She's here. Yes. So if you could tell any of your colleagues and comrades, hey, if you want to have Jeremy talk to you, I'm game for it at any time. Okay.
We'll put it out there. Thank you, Jeremy.
Okay, this was terrific.
Can I say I
Please,
just wanted to share something.
Go ahead, Dave.
And I will, there is going to be a blurb in the upcoming print newsletter. So maybe you'll get some chapters to take you up on that offer. I just wanted to say, second what other people were saying, we can't be attached to results, at least not results coming from our government, from the top, from the people that are, controlling, seem to be controlling everything. I think that we, the people, there's a very large percentage of Americans who are anti-war. You would never know it. And I think VFP and groups like us have done a lot to move that, you know. When my partner and I were on a train heading to Dallas for that convention where Cindy Sheehan launched her Camp Casey action, I remember sitting in the dining area talking to a woman. We were saying, "Oh yeah, we're going to this Veterans for Peace convention." And we described what Veterans for Peace was and what it was about. She was just wowed by the whole concept of Veterans for Peace. And she's like, "Oh, well, that'll be like in the news or something. Like this is a big thing." And we're like, "Well, probably not. Probably won't see it in the media." But sure enough, because of what Cindy Sheehan did, it did make a big news splash. And then I remember talking on the phone to my mother, and my mother saying, "Yeah, I agree with that Cindy Sheehan." Like, you know, so there's like these little, um, this proof that people are being moved and that they're movable. And so it's, up to us to break through that sound barrier, and that's what you're doing with this book. So thank you very much for putting it down in black and white and showing, reflecting the movement back to us. It is a powerful movement, and yeah, we're just out there planting the seeds, and we never know where those ripples are going to lead.
Right. Terrific. Thanks so much. Beautifully said. And then this was great. So much fun. Tarak has his finger pointed upwards. Yes.
Yeah, I just want you to hold the book up again so
Ah,
everyone can get a good look at it.
yeah, it has a cool cover. My authors
Right,
usually
right,
hate their
right.
covers, but this is a cool cover, and it's backwards. So, I wish I had
And
it
where
here.
can
Thank you.
people get it,
I mean,
Jeremy?
from the publisher, University of Chicago Press or Amazon. Those people don't like that for various reasons. I mean, if you just Google this or and then under, purchase or shopping, you'll find several options. But great. Thanks so much. This was super.
Thank you.
Okay, peace.
Thank you,
Yep.
Jeremy.
Yep.
Thanks, Jeremy.